Hey everybody, Dean here with RC Driver. Glad you all joined us today. What we have here is the Tekno RC EB410. This is their four-wheel drive 10th scale off-road buggy. It's highly anticipated because it's something new, different, and original. Tekno has been around for many years making conversion kits for some of the more popular nitro 8th scale off-road buggies. They then ventured and made their own vehicles, the EB410, the ET48, and several other vehicles. But they were always 8th scale. They had a short course truck as well. They've got a monster truck. But now they've ventured into the 10th scale off-road market that has been dominated by a few brands for many years. So they went to the drawing board, started with a clean slate of paper, and came up with something new, different, and original, as I said. And for all intents and purposes, it looks like something that will dominate the track. There is so much on this buggy. I actually printed out, I made notes about all the things about it just so I didn't miss something. That's something I usually don't do. So why don't we get started with the instructions. Instructions on this vehicle are top-notch. I've been building vehicles for 25 years. Some instructions are considerably better than others. These are some of the best on the market, bar none. They're easy to follow. They've got notes specifically where to add thread lock, reminding you not to over tighten screws, and the list goes on and on and on. There was one minor hiccup where you install the steering servo. You can install either a standard size servo or a low profile servo. I opted for a low profile servo, and you have to jump ahead a couple pages for those instructions. But other than that minor hiccup, the instructions on this buggy are absolutely flawless, well detailed, and easy to follow. Toward the end of the instructions, there's a notes section that tells you about how to tune the vehicle, which is very helpful, especially if you're a beginner, or even if you've been racing for a few years. It's always good to read these sections of the instructions to remind yourself of how certain setup changes will impact the handling characteristics of the car. So nice job, Tekno, for including that. Let's now talk about the build of the EB410. The build of this kit was absolutely flawless. This thing went together like it was a Swiss timepiece. The fit and the finish were near perfect. I didn't have to go and deburr the A-arms. I didn't have to sand any of the knuckles or any of the little pieces to make sure the arms dropped as they were supposed to. Everything went together as it should have. From the shocks to the diffs, the drivetrain, and everything in between, it went together perfectly. Little interesting note, they tell you to build the diffs, run the car for a couple of batteries, and then rebuild the diffs so they could set in and be smooth. I thought these diffs were incredibly smooth as soon as I built them, so I can only imagine how this car is going to feel once it's been run for several days. It's probably just going to feel like absolute butter. I didn't build it though to spec of the instructions. I'm running this car on carpet. Most people who have done reviews of the EB410 have run it on dirt or clay. I'm running it on carpet, a really high traction surface. Matt Walter from Tekno had a setup sheet available at the Tekno website. I used that as my starting point, and I actually spoke with him on the phone and made a few adjustments from there. I will later be posting the setup sheet we used, but we used some different diff oil, some different shock fluids, and I also did add the front sway bar that is an option. So let's talk about the features of the EB410. And we're going to start off with the chassis and the way this car was designed. Again, Tekno started with a clean sheet of paper when they decided to build a four-wheel drive 10th scale buggy. They looked at what tracks were like across the country and around the world, and for the most part, tracks are very high traction these days. With that in mind, they decided to move all the weight as much as possible forward in the car. The first thing they did in order to accomplish this was they gave it a reverse bell crank system. This mounts the steering system to the front bulkhead, and it saves a great deal of room. They were then able to move the motor, the battery, the speed control, the steering servo more forward. In fact, all of your electronics package is found from the center diff forward on this vehicle. The chassis on the EB410 is made out of 3mm thick 7075 aluminum. The chassis has been strategically machined to drop the overall weight and increase flex in just the right areas. The chassis is very low center of gravity in nature to help increase your cornering speed. So again, You're going to be able to get on the throttle really quick coming out of corners and stay on it as much as possible going into corners. There's also nice little features like wiring guides built in for your battery wires. Again, not something that other cars have, and it's a nice feature on here. Another cool feature is the EB410 utilizes a pair of rear chassis braces or chassis stiffeners, one on each side. One is a little bit longer than the other, and each chassis brace or stiffener attaches to the chassis with 2 screws. You can loosen these screws or take them out altogether to tune the vehicle to the track you're running on. Now, when we started off running this car, all the screws on the bottom of the chassis were tight. We did eventually loosen some up, and in fact, we took out all of the screws on the rear chassis brace, and it really helped the car rotate through the corners better. Now, if you're a beginner, I would not recommend removing that rear chassis brace, as it's going to increase the flex, and if you have a hard crash, you have a chance of tweaking the chassis. But if you're an experienced racer who's accustomed to tuning things, you might want to play with that feature to get the car dialed in. Let's move on to the suspension and start right away with the shocks. Tekno went with 13mm big bore shocks. Most other 10th scale vehicles, in fact, all that I know of, run 12mm shocks. Tekno went a millimeter bigger than everyone else and created a very, very plush setup here. The 13mm bore shocks are complemented nicely by 3.5mm thick shafts. It uses a pair of X-ring type seals to keep the oil in there. It's got emulsion style caps with bleeder valves. So again, it's a really smooth setup. And another feature I've only seen Tekno do on their 8th scale vehicles, and they carried it over to this 10th scale vehicle, the shock perches, the spring perches, are held in place by a long set screw. They're not going to pop off in a race and cause your car to become ill-handling. So nice job, very nice attention to detail with that. To go along with the shocks, and again, something I've seen on 8th scale vehicles before, but not 10th scale vehicles, each suspension arm has a droop screw built in, so you can tighten these droop screws down to lower the car or loosen them up to raise your ride height. So if you've got a good suspension setup and you want to change the ride height but don't want to change the preload of the shocks, you can use the droop screws. So very nice feature. Moving on to the shock towers. The front shock tower is crazy thick. It's 10mm thick. The rear shock tower is 8mm thick. So should this car land hard upside down, these shock towers are not going to fail. Really nice job overbuilding these shock towers to keep them strong and sturdy. I did already mention the dual reversed bell crank on this. It's really smooth. It rides on 4 ball bearings, but something to note, there is no servo saver with the steering bell crank, so be sure you pick up a very high quality steering servo, something with steel or titanium gears preferably. You're also going to want something with a high amount of torque. Tekno suggests at least 150 inch-ounces of torque, and you'll definitely want to get a high-speed servo to go along with that high torque. The front and rear suspension arms, the knuckles, the hubs on this car are all extremely beefy. They are designed to take a great deal of abuse without failing. You're not going to need to buy aftermarket arms. You're probably never going to need to buy a replacement arm unless you hit a wall head on or a car is stopped in the middle of a straightaway and you whack that while you're at full speed. So again, Tekno realized a fatal flaw to many four-wheel drive vehicles was their inability to finish a race. They designed this car to withstand a great deal of abuse and finish a race. In fact, finish a weekend of races for that matter without having to buy too many spare parts. Speaking of the steering knuckles have little button head screws that you install that act as stops. Again, I haven't seen this on too many 10 scale vehicles before. Tekno has you start off with 2 washers behind that screw to limit the steering a little bit. You could take those washers out to increase your steering throw. You can add a couple more washers if you want to limit your steering throw. So again, another nice feature that Tekno has thought of. Additionally, they've thought of ways to prevent future failures. They put set screws at your kingpin spots here to make sure they don't back off. There's a set screw up here next to where the ball stud is on your C-hub, so it doesn't next to the additional hole to keep things nice and tight. And what I like again about the instructions, it reminds you, snug, don't over tighten to help the plastic last a long time. The front and rear suspension blocks, the A, B, C, and D suspension blocks, are all made out of 7075 aluminum. They have plastic inserts or pills that you can use a different variety of to help tune the car. The hinge pins that mount into your suspension blocks are 3 millimeters thick. So again, from the aluminum suspension blocks to the thick 3 millimeter thick hinge pins, again, the car is built tough, it's built to last, it's built to finish a race. And again, it's also extremely tunable. So if you show up at a track and you thought your setup was good and it's not, without too much hassle, you can make some changes to dial this car in. The EB410 uses a trio of high volume gear differentials. These diffs hold more oil than any other 10th scale four-wheel drive vehicle on the market. That means you don't have to run diff oil as thick as other vehicles, and it allows the diffs to work really nicely and they don't get soft after a long run. Inside each diff are high strength steel gears as well as high strength steel ring and pinion gears. Inside the diffs, the cross pins that the spider gears run on are made of composite plastic, so those are also lightweight to reduce rotating mass, and it also makes building the diff a little bit easier. The outdrives and the couplers have been machined to be as light as possible, again, reducing rotating mass. Moving to the center of the drivetrain, the front and rear drive shafts are dog bone style, and they're also made out of aluminum, again reducing overall weight of the drivetrain. CVA style drive shafts are found on all four corners. There's 12 millimeter wheel adapters and lightweight serrated wheel nuts. So again, the drivetrain is made to be tough, but it's also been lightened in every way possible without sacrificing durability to help this car accelerate like a rocket. The EB410 also has a two-piece aluminum 7075 motor mount. The motor mount is adjusted by tightening or loosening two screws. Additionally, the kit comes with an optional plastic cooling fan mount. So you want to keep your motor running nice and cool. You can mount a fan to it really easily. Just buy a fan, have two screws ready, pop it right on and plug it into your receiver, and when the car turns on, the fan would turn on and blow directly on the motor to keep it running cool and efficiently. Like all other high-end vehicles on the market, the EB410 does not come with tires, wheels, or electronics. So let me tell you about what I decided to install. Starting with the motor, I went with a Trinity 13.5 turn Monster Max motor. Trinity has been around for a great many years. They've won too many national titles to count, a handful of world titles, and everything I've read says the Monster Max 13.5 is a go-to motor for racing. I went with a New Wave 4600 milliamp 100C lithium high voltage battery. This battery packs quite a bit of punch, so I'm really excited to get it out on the track. I went with a Gröpner X8E radio system. This radio has got a great feel to it, and it's got more features than I can even begin to tell you about, and it's also got a cool color display that is touchscreen, so it's really easy to use. I went with a ProTech T160 servo and a Gröpner GM speed control. For tires and wheels, I went with Proline Pinpoint rear tires, Wedge front tires, Velocity wheels, and Chris at Off the Wall. I asked him to give me a one-color paint job because time was a factor in getting this car raced and reviewed, but he said I can't give you one color, so he threw this together for me in about 2 days, and I'm really happy. Chris at Off the Wall does phenomenal work, and again, he got this done for me really, really quickly. I did install a couple aftermarket parts. I went with a WTF Wild Turbo fan, cooling fan that's on the motor, and I did install the optional Tekno sway bar kit for the front. So I'm really excited. I've told you about the instructions, I've told you about the build, I've told you about all of the features, I might have even missed a few, and I've told you about my running gear, so now I think it's time to show you guys some action of this thing out on the track. EB410 on high traction carpet is going to be a hard car to beat week in and week out. Whether you're racing at the club level or at a higher end national level, the EB410 has got the features to compete. I drove it as well as 4 or 5 other people at RC Madness, and everyone was really impressed. We all felt that with just a little bit of tuning, this car can compete with any other brand on the market to take the win. Some things to note. As I thought, this car accelerates like a rocket. You pull the throttle and it takes off, and it feels absolutely planted the entire time. I thought the back end might be a little bit squirrely since there's no weight. When you hit the throttle, the back end just sinks down and bites in. When you steer, the car rips around the corner. At first, we were having a few problems with the back end lifting a little bit. I went back to the setup sheet that Matt Walters has, and I noticed that he does not run a rear chassis brace. So the first thing we did, we took out a couple of the screws. We didn't want to go too crazy. And immediately the car really hooked up around corners a little bit better. I decided to take out all 4 of the rear chassis brace screws. The car was absolutely planted. The rear tires stopped lifting when we were cornering hard. Jumping. Again, I thought the car might be a little nose heavy when it jumped. It jumps plush and flat. If you go a little crooked, a little bit of brake in the air, a little bit of throttle in the air, or steering the wheels, the car responds immediately. So again, it's a quick car, it's a nimble car. We did have a few tumbles. We cartwheeled it once or twice on the infield. A couple scuffs, you know, there's a tiny little crack in the rear wing, but it's absolutely tough as nails. I do think with a little bit of tuning, maybe a different tire in the front, something with a smaller sidewall, a little bit thicker oil, and a stiffer front spring. When the aftermarket springs come out from Tekno, I'm definitely going to go with a stiffer front spring. This car will be absolutely dialed. I let one of my buddies, Zach Berry, drive this thing on Friday night at the club race. He had 10 practice laps with it, and that was it. He qualified 5th for the A main. He finished 5th. In his second qualifier, he was actually on a TQ run, but rolled it. It happens. But again, he was really impressed with the car too, and he had no time behind the wheel prior to the other night. So again, all in all, this car is absolutely going to be a beast on the track that people are going to really look out for. This car's been out for a little while now, and there are some other aftermarket parts out. Yep, I already added the front sway bar. I added the WTF Wild Turbofan cooling fan. Other items I would recommend. While the plastic servo arm is doing good for me, I'm definitely going to pick up the aluminum servo arm. There is no servo saver, so I want to make sure the steering system on this stays as tight as possible. And I'd hate to lose a race because a plastic servo arm failed. And I'll probably pick up some of the carbon fiber aftermarket goodies. There's carbon fiber shock towers, a carbon fiber battery strap. That would help save weight. Another couple ways you might want to save weight, you could pick up a titanium screw kit for this car and maybe titanium turnbuckles. That might help you drop a few grams as well if you're concerned about that. But I do think, the car's not too heavy, but, dropping a few grams is never a bad idea. My overall impression of this car is it's an absolute blast to drive. It's a really good value. It's $399.99, about the same cost as any other four-wheel drive buggy on the market. And it's something new and different. I said it before, I'll say it again. Tekno started with a clean sheet of paper. They threw away the cookie cutters that other manufacturers use for, your basic drivetrain layout, this, that, and the next thing. And they've come up with something original and something that most importantly works. If you're thinking of getting a four-wheel drive buggy, take a long look at this one. There are waiting lists from coast to coast to get one of these. So if you can get one, grab it. You will not be disappointed. Tekno did their homework, and in my opinion, they have hit a home run. I want to thank you for watching this video today. Please give it a like. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like us on Facebook, and always go to rcdriver.com for all you need to know about RC.